Snow did not fall so much as it settled, soft and slow, as though it too had come here to grieve. Clementine Wade stood with a rusted tin lantern clutched in her gloved hand, its light dim against the white hush swallowing the pasture. Just beyond the fence posts, under a crooked pine, her husband's grave sat beneath 6 inches of snow and growing. She hadn't wept in weeks. Now her breath came tight, the frost burning her nostrils while the silence pressed in like hands against her ribs. The storm hadn't let up in 2 days, and the wind hissed through the slats of the barn, making the horses restless. She'd meant only to check on the mare with a swollen belly, maybe fix that dangling hinge if her fingers would obey her. But as she stepped past the barn's lean-to, her boot struck something. A fresh, sunken shape. A footprint. Then another. Her breath caught. There were no riders. No wagons. No town boys come by for favors or trade. These prints were wide, spaced far, as if belonging to someone tall. She followed them, lantern raised, the wind gnawing her ears. And then, another noise. A low groan. She stepped into the barn, her breath trembling in the halo of the lantern. The mare snorted but didn't kick. Something shifted behind the feed barrels. Clem didn't speak. She set the lantern down and reached for the rifle hanging from a nail in the barn beam. Her father's rifle. She hated the thing. Her husband had kept it cleaned. She hadn't touched it since the funeral. The figure was hunched in shadow, broad-shouldered, nearly blending into the gloom, his limbs tucked in like a wounded animal. Her hands shook as she raised the barrel, breath shallow. "Get up," she said, her voice low and hoarse. He moved slowly, not startled, as though he'd known she'd come eventually. His height startled her. He nearly brushed the rafters when he straightened, but his movements were heavy, strained. Snow still clung to his black hair, thick and matted. His chest rose and fell like he'd run miles. An Apache. His skin was dark and ruddy from wind and cold, his jaw lined with the beginnings of a beard. A long rip marked his side. Bloody fabric clung to the wound beneath his ribs. He didn't reach for a weapon. He simply raised one hand, palm out, then staggered and leaned hard against the post. "I ain't got trouble for you," he said, voice barely above the wind's howl. Clem's finger hovered near the trigger. He sank to one knee, hands open now, as if he was offering himself up. Not in threat, just surrender. It was then she noticed his knuckles, red with cold, chapped raw. She could see each breath he exhaled, labored and deep. The mare let out a soft nicker, and he turned to her, not flinching, not afraid, then back to Clem. "One night," he rasped. "I go." Her heart beat hard in her ears. The wind hissed again outside, and snow pressed in against the doorframe, as if trying to listen. Clem didn't lower the gun. "Not yet." "You bleeding?" she asked, eyes narrowing. He nodded once. Her gaze flicked to the dark stain on the hay. Blood. Real. Fresh. She knew the look of suffering. She lived with it. Every morning when the wind hit her cheekbone, every time she stared at her reflection, and didn't recognize the hollow beneath her eyes, she remembered. She lowered the rifle. Without a word, she walked to the corner, picked up an old horse blanket, and tossed it in his direction. It fell with a soft thunk at his feet. "One night," she said. He didn't smile, didn't thank her. Just reached for the blanket, his fingers trembling slightly, and wrapped it over his shoulders. He eased down beside the stall, leaning back slowly as though pain cracked through his spine. She turned and left. Back in the house, Clem bolted the door with a strength that surprised her. The fire was low, but she didn't stir it. She sat in her dead husband's rocking chair and listened. To the wind, the silence, the howl of a winter that didn't know kindness. She didn't sleep. In the hours before dawn, she peered out the window once and saw no light in the barn. But somehow, she knew he hadn't left. When morning broke, gray and heavy, she found a tin plate on the porch. Clean. Not a crumb left of the cornbread she'd left near the barn before sunup. The blanket was folded neatly just inside the barn door. But he wasn't gone. He stood in the snow beyond the fence line, shoveling. Clearing the drift near the paddock where she usually walked, his tall form moving slow but deliberate. He didn't look toward the window. He didn't wait for thanks. She didn't tell him to stop. Later that day, Clem sat at the kitchen table, running a cloth over a chipped cup. Something in her stirred. Something not quite hope and not quite fear. It had been nearly 2 winters since anyone but the churchfolk came calling. Since anyone had eaten her bread without pretending they pitied her. Her neighbors barely said her name now. Not since she turned down Etta Voss's brother's offer to help run the ranch. Not since she buried her husband and chose silence over a second chance that felt like charity. That night, she left another tin out. Again, it came back clean. And again, he didn't leave. On the 3rd morning, she found the barn's broken latch had been mended. Rough, splintered wood, but it held strong against the wind now. No note. No mark. She stepped outside and saw him by the fence, watching the mare as she moved through the snow. He didn't wave. He simply turned and walked away, back toward the barn. She stood there a while, arms wrapped around herself, steam rising from her breath. The snowstorm hadn't stopped. The wind had only grown sharper. But in the stillness between gusts, the silence no longer frightened her. It felt full somehow. Shared. Inside, she sat down beside the hearth, her fingers tracing the stitching on a patchwork quilt. Her husband's scent had faded. The silence he left behind had grown cold. But in the barn, there was life. Movement. The presence of someone who didn't ask, didn't explain, just did what needed doing. A stranger. An Apache. And yet she'd seen no hate in his eyes. No hunger. Only weariness. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring. Maybe he'd leave before the next snow. Maybe others would come looking. But tonight, the barn was warm. The wind howled, and she lit the lamp anyway. Because he was still here. And somehow, that changed everything. At first light, the sky blushed pale blue behind clouds too heavy to lift. Snow still fell, but slower now, like feathers released one by one. Clementine Wade stood behind the kitchen curtain, hands tucked into her shawl, watching him. He was by the barn again. No hat, no coat. Just the same patched blanket wrapped over his shoulders, the edges trailing behind as he moved. The snow clung to his braids and lashes, but he didn't flinch. He fed the mare first, slow, careful strokes over her flank, murmuring something she seemed to understand. Then he shoveled, clearing the path between barn and gate, though she hadn't asked. She didn't call out. She didn't thank him. But she noticed, every motion, every silence. The man never knocked. Never entered without cause. He slept in the barn still, even after the night she'd left coffee on the step in an old enamel mug. It was returned the next morning, washed. The handle had been mended with twine. In the village, they would call him a savage. In whispers. In the corners of stores and behind prayer books. But to Clementine, nothing about him felt wild. Not the way he fixed the fence post that had been broken since last autumn. Not the way he stepped aside when she came near, as if refusing to take up space that wasn't offered. Not the way he always looked down when she spoke, not out of rudeness, but respect. She didn't know his name. But she knew his silence. She'd lived beside it for 2 winters now, ever since she buried her husband and came back alone from the hills. Grief didn't make noise. It just settled in the corners of the house like soot. He moved with the same kind of quiet. That morning, she tore a square of cloth from a muslin apron and folded it tight. Then she took a heel of bread, a sliver of salted pork, and wrapped them in the cloth. She didn't write a note. Just placed the bundle on the fence post between the paddock and the barn, then turned back inside. From the window, she watched him find it. He stood there a long while, snow falling soft around his shoulders. Then he picked it up, opened it, and held the cloth in both hands as though it were something finer than it was. He looked toward the house once, but not at the window. Just the shape of the door. Later that day, he came to the steps. Clem heard him before she saw him. Boots on wood, slow and careful. She didn't reach for the rifle. She opened the door a crack. The man held something in his hand. A carving, small, rough, made from cedar. It was the mare. Her mare. Down to the white stripe on her nose. He'd even notched the ear where she'd torn it on barbed wire last summer. He said nothing. Just held it out. Clem didn't take it right away. She looked at it. At him. His face was windburnt, sharp around the cheekbones but young. Or at least, young enough to remember gentleness. His eyes were deep brown, warmer than the snow deserved. When she finally took the horse, her fingers brushed his for the briefest moment. She thought he might step back. But he didn't. He only nodded once. Then turned, and left the porch the way he'd come. That night, the wind picked up again. The storm wasn't over, it was only changing its tune. The trees groaned under the weight of snow. Clementine lit every lantern in the house. She didn't sleep. In the barn, she knew he curled up in the farthest corner, against the hay, beside the warmth of the mare. She should have asked his name. She told herself it didn't matter. But she wanted to. The next morning brought a different kind of trouble. She rode into town, needing flour and lamp oil. The roads were glassy with frost, the sky clean for the first time in days. Her breath smoked like a kettle spout, and her coat clung damp to her ribs by the time she tied off her horse outside the general store. Inside, it was warmer. But not kind. Hank Bellinger squinted at her from behind his spectacles as he bagged the flour. "You got tracks round your barn, Miss Wade," he said, tone flat. "Someone's been staying up there?" Clementine didn't flinch. "Stray took shelter," she said. "Storm's been cruel." "Ain't no common stray makes prints that large," he muttered. "Saw him myself, couple days back. Looked like Apache to me." He paused, leaned in. "You ought to be careful. The kind that slips through a fence without knocking won't think twice about what he takes next." "I got nothing left to take," she answered, voice calm. He didn't press further. But his eyes said plenty. She took her bag and walked out before the gossip could stick. By the time she returned home, there were fresh shoveling marks leading up to her steps. The porch had been cleared. The pile of firewood she left scattered was now stacked in a perfect line. The door didn't creak. The latch had been oiled. She said nothing, but her heart did a strange thing. Tightened, then warmed. The sun set early that day. And with it, so did the part of her that once held back out of fear. She opened the front door, and placed a mug of warm broth on the top stair. Then stepped back. From the barn came soft steps, the crunch of snow. He didn't knock. Just looked at the cup. Looked at her. She nodded. He picked it up, eyes never quite meeting hers, and drank in slow, grateful swallows. Then he set it down, bowed his head, and walked back into the dark. She closed the door softly. Later that evening, she stood by the fireplace, the cedar carving in her hand. She turned it over and over, thumb grazing the notched ear. He didn't know she was watching. He didn't know he was being seen in ways that mattered. But for the first time in 2 years, she wasn't waiting for someone to save her. She wasn't shrinking. She was choosing. Quietly. Intentionally. And she'd chosen not to turn him away. The storm outside whispered against the windows like a lullaby not meant for children. The barn stood firm. Her home was no longer empty. And the footprints in the snow, those wide, steady prints, led not away from her land, but toward it. And each day, she let them. The snow didn't stop, it simply learned to whisper. Each morning, the world returned blank, as if the night had erased it with a gentle hand. Fence posts vanished under white domes, and even the tallest pine trees bent beneath the weight. Clementine Wade no longer bothered sweeping the porch. What melted would melt. What stayed was meant to stay. He had not left. Still, she did not know his name. But by now, the house carried his presence. The fence line was mended, and the firewood never ran low. The porch steps no longer groaned. She found her late husband's gloves stitched from the inside, as though someone had mended them in silence. He didn't ask for space. He simply made it better. Clementine had grown used to his shape at the edge of her view. His tall form cutting through the white like a shadow in motion. Shoveling paths, brushing snow off the henhouse roof, tending to the mare with reverence no one else ever gave. It became their language. He did not knock. She did not speak. Yet they answered each other daily. But the town noticed. On the 4th trip into town, the air felt different. People stared longer. A child was pulled closer by her mother. The pastor's wife nodded without warmth. At the mercantile, Etta Voss was waiting. Looks like you got yourself a guest, she said too brightly, wrapping a bolt of muslin in paper. Tall fella. Brown-skinned. Not from around here. Clem kept her hands steady. Ain't nobody's business what happens on my land. Well, the marshal might think different. Etta's smile thinned. Some folks say he's a deserter. Some say he's hiding from justice. Some folks talk too much. Clementine took her things and left. Back home, the storm waited. It always did. The wind scraped like nails on the window glass, and the hearth gave off that low, contented crackle that only comes when someone else has kept it burning. She found him in the barn, kneeling beside the mare. His hand rested on her flank, eyes half closed, the air warm from her breath. The animal trusted him. Clementine watched from the door a long while before speaking. Town's starting to notice, she said. He didn't look at her. Just kept his palm on the mare's ribs. They'll come asking questions. He nodded once, slowly. You gonna give me your name? She asked, softer now. Dakota, he said. It settled into the air like a feather. She repeated it, testing it on her tongue. Dakota, she said again. It means something. He nodded again. Friend to everyone. The silence that followed was heavier than the storm outside. She stepped into the barn fully, letting the door swing behind her. Her boots crunched straw. That true? He looked at her then. Really looked. His eyes were dark and deep, but not haunted, just tired. Used to be. His voice was low. Gravel-soft. It held a kind of peace she hadn't heard in years. Later that evening while supper cooked, she found the cedar carving again. This time with a second figure carved beside the mare. It was her. Or something meant to resemble her. Apron tied at the back, braid down her shoulder. Simple. Honest. She didn't ask how he'd known her posture, her stance, the way her head tilted when she listened. But it was there, plain as print. She set it on the windowsill. That night, the wind rose again, keening like an orphan through the trees. The barn shuddered. The mare kicked. Clem lit her lantern and stepped out into the dark. She didn't knock this time either. Inside the barn, the roof was sagging under snow. Dakota stood shirtless, hammer in hand, trying to brace a beam with what little lumber remained. Water dripped in thin threads through the cracks, and the rafters groaned. You'll break your back, she said, rushing in. I'll mend it. The barn or your spine? He smiled, just a flicker. She hadn't seen that before. It was like sunlight behind storm clouds, brief but golden. They worked in silence until dawn. The storm did not stop. But the barn held. The next morning, Clem allowed him into the house, not just the porch. Not just for broth. She gestured to the cot near the hearth. Storm's worsening. It's warmer in here. He hesitated. I don't wish to shame you. You're not, she said. They shame themselves. He entered slowly. Removed his boots. Sat on the edge of the cot like he didn't trust it to hold him. She poured coffee. Neither spoke. When she handed him the cup, their fingers brushed again. It lingered. A few days passed. The storm howled and hissed and rattled the windows. But inside it was quiet. And warm. Until a sharp knock broke it all. Clementine opened the door to Marshal Roan. He tipped his hat, eyes scanning past her shoulder. Miss Wade. Marshal. Been talk from town. Says you're harboring someone. I'm not harboring. I'm feeding. Is he here? He's here, she said. Healing. Working. Asking for nothing. Roan shifted on his boots. You know who he is? I know he ain't harmed me. There's a bounty out of Wyoming. Deserter from a work camp. Name's Dakota Gray Wolf. She stiffened. But not in fear. You come to take him? I came to see if I needed to. Her jaw tensed. You don't. Roan looked toward the barn. He helping on your land? He's been keeping the roof from caving in. Roan sighed. Folks won't like it. Then folks can shovel my walk, she said flatly. Until then, they can keep their opinions to themselves. The marshal nodded once. He stays quiet, he stays. She closed the door before the snow could blow in. Later that evening, she told Dakota what was said. He listened. Nodded. Didn't offer an excuse. I ran, he said, after they lynched a boy for stealing a coat. Not his coat. Not even the right size. They just needed someone to hang. She looked at him, heart clenching. You watched it? I held his legs so it wouldn't take long. Her hand reached for his then. No hesitation. He didn't pull away this time. She didn't speak. Just let her hand rest over his, warm and trembling. And he let her. Outside, the storm gathered itself again. But inside the walls of that house, two people sat beside a fire. Not speaking, not asking, not rushing. Something had shifted. The storm had not left. But neither had he. Snow peeled from the sky in thin, blinding sheets. The trees groaned under its weight, their arms stretched wide like mourners in prayer. The hush was deceptive. Beneath it, the world still lived, still hungered. Clementine Wade woke to the shriek of a sheep. By the time she threw on her coat and pulled her boots over bare feet, the second scream had died mid-throat. The lantern flared to life in her trembling hand. She didn't stop to think. Just followed the drag marks through the white, gun swinging loose in her grip. She found the carcass near the pine edge. What was left of it? Blood steamed in the snow. Prints circled it, sharp and deliberate. Not a coyote's scatter. Not a bear. These were wolves. Big. Organized. Hungry. The air changed. She turned, just in time to see their eyes flicker between branches. She ran. Snow clung to her skirts like clawing hands. Her breath came in sharp bursts. Her boot caught a root buried in drift, and she fell hard, the wind knocked from her ribs. She didn't rise. Somewhere behind her, a growl low and guttural echoed. And then, a shout. Not in English. Another voice, louder. Closer. Dakota's. Clem lifted her head as a thunderous sound split the trees. The report of a rifle, sharp and sure. Another followed. Then the whine of a wounded animal, trailing into the pines. Strong arms gathered her before she fully came to. She felt the warmth of his chest against her cheek, the rise and fall of his breathing. You're all right, he murmured. I have you. She hadn't realized she'd started crying. He carried her back through the storm, his strides long and even, the snow giving way beneath him like it recognized its better. Her hands clung to his shirt without pride. Only need. Back inside, he sat her near the fire and pulled the boots from her feet gently, one at a time. Her ankle was swelling. You were fast, she whispered. I was watching, he said simply. When he stood to get water, she caught his hand. You saved me. You gave me shelter. Neither spoke again for a long while. Outside, wind howled like the wolves hadn't left. 2 days passed before she could walk again. In that time, he did not leave her side. Cooked simple things. Kept the fire full. Never spoke more than needed. He told her when she asked, that wolves followed the scent of grief. They know where something's already been lost, he said. They wait near sorrow. That afternoon, the townsfolk came. Hank Bellinger and 2 others, riding with purpose. The marshal stayed behind, but his shadow was in their eyes. They stopped at the fence, voices raised. Clem stepped outside, rifle across her shoulder. Her ankle still ached, but she did not limp. What is it now? She asked. Hank's horse stamped at the snow. We come for the Apache. The one sleeping in your barn. He's not in my barn. One of the men, Tom Withers, a slow brute of a man, spit. So he's in your bed then? The wind paused. So did her breath. You watch your tongue, she said low. He's wanted. We got a right. You got a grudge, she answered. But no right. Tom grunted. You siding with him over your own? She looked them each in the eye. He's never raised a hand to me. Never took a thing that wasn't broken first. He fixed more than any of you ever have. A silence followed. Hank cleared his throat. We don't want trouble, Miss Wade. But folk are talking to. Let them talk. He's a danger. No. He's a man. And he saved my life while you were busy gossiping over dry goods. They didn't expect that. Didn't expect her to square her shoulders like a tree that would not bend. Didn't expect the cold to cling to her like armor. When they left, they didn't look back. Inside, she found Dakota sitting at the hearth, as though he hadn't moved. He looked up when she entered. She didn't speak right away. Just went to the kitchen, poured coffee and brought it to him. He took it without a word, but his hands brushed hers. You heard. I heard. She sat beside him on the floor, shoulder to shoulder. You could leave, if it'd make things easier. I've lived easy, he said. It broke me. She smiled at that, small, tired but real. Later, as dusk folded over the house, she asked, What did they call you before all this? Dakota Gray Wolf. She looked at him. You don't seem a wolf. He didn't answer right away. Wolves stay together, he said finally. Until they can't. Her breath caught. That night, she didn't lock the door. She left the lamp burning on the table. And when he passed by her chair to stoke the fire one last time, she reached out and touched his arm. Not by accident, not in passing. This time, he held her hand. In the deep of night, the snow pressed close against the walls, but neither of them stirred. Outside, the wolves had moved on. But the tracks they left pointed inward. Toward home. The snow had begun to melt. Not with urgency, but with patience, like a curtain slowly drawing back on a stage no longer needed. Water dripped from the eaves in soft rhythms, and the ground beneath the pines breathed again, brown and broken but alive. Clementine Wade stood at the porch rail, a tin cup warming her fingers. Dakota worked in the paddock, sleeves rolled, his arms corded with quiet strength. He wasn't mending fences now. He was building. Straight lines, measured spaces, a new barn frame rising where the old had nearly caved. The boards he'd scavenged, planed, and shaped with hand tools alone. He'd made something from ruin. She hadn't asked him to. That morning, she'd watched him pause mid-hammer and turn his face toward the sun like a man learning to breathe again. And she knew. He wasn't hiding anymore. But peace in the Wild West did not last long. It never had. They came late in the day. 3 riders. Not townsfolk this time. Bounty men. They bore no badges, only weather-beaten hats, sharp eyes, and a sheet of paper damp with snowmelt. One held it out as she stepped onto the porch. Her heart beat slow. Her jaw clenched tight. The paper bore Dakota's name, and an amount. Too high for comfort. Too low for a man's worth. We're tucking him in, one said. You'll want to stand aside Mississippi. I don't, she answered. He's a wanted man. He's my man, she said, not loud but sure. The tallest one dismounted. Miss, you best think on what you're saying. I have, she said. Every night since he carried me out of the storm. Behind her, Dakota stepped onto the porch. Bareheaded. Calm. You want to take me, he said, voice even. You'll have to explain why a man can't leave a death camp without a noose following. You took the law into your own hands, the shorter one barked. No, Dakota replied. I took a dying boy down before they made it slow. The men hesitated. You gonna hang him for mercy? Clem said, stepping between them. Or for making your town less shameful? One of the riders, youngest of the 3, shifted his gaze. Ma'am, we're just here for coin. We don't write the laws. No, she said, rifle now cradled in her arms. But you choose which ones you obey. The tall one's hand hovered near his belt. Dakota didn't move. Neither did Clementine. Then, from the edge of the trees, hoofbeats. Marshal Roan. He rode up slow, dismounted like a man who'd seen everything twice and still found it ugly. He glanced at the bounty paper, then looked toward Dakota. Gentlemen, the marshal said. This bounty expired last month. That ain't what we heard. I'm not concerned with what you heard, Roan said, voice like dry timber. I'm concerned with what the new governor rescinded. No bounty, no arrest. But he's under her roof. She's a widow, and she's chosen. Silence stretched. Law stands with the household now, Roan added. You take one step past that rail, I call it trespass. The bounty men didn't argue further. They turned, spurred their horses, and left without farewells. When the last hoofbeat faded, the air settled. Still and sacred. Clem's shoulders dropped. Her breath trembled out of her. Dakota turned to her, something unreadable in his eyes. You didn't have to stand for me, he said. Yes, she replied, voice catching. I did. You could have sent me away. I never told you, she said, stepping closer. But that night you first stayed, you weren't the only one needing shelter. Her hand found his chest, rested above his heart. You gave me peace, she whispered. I didn't know I could still feel that. Dakota didn't speak. He wrapped his arms around her and held her there, as if she were the only thing that had ever been steady in his life. She closed her eyes against his shoulder. Neither said the word for it. But it was love. Not loud, not sudden. Not the kind that burns out quick. It was the kind that endures snowstorms and silence and judgment. The kind that shows itself in carved wood and cleared porches, in fences mended and hands held through the dark. Later that evening, she found him in the half-built barn, smoothing a beam. She stepped up beside him, hands still warm from where he'd held it. I've still got the cot, she said. He raised a brow. But I'm not offering it, she added. Not tonight. He turned to her slowly, question lingering in his expression. I'm saying stay, she whispered. I'm saying, don't sleep in the barn no more. Not when you've already built yourself a place in this house. He didn't answer in words. Instead, he took her hand again. Not trembling. Not careful. Just sure. And together, they walked through the doorway. Later, the fire crackled. Wind brushed against the window panes, gentle now. Outside, the last of the snow melted in the shadow of the new barn. The wolves were long gone. The bounty hunters scattered. But two people, once abandoned, once hunted, sat side by side beneath a roof they both now called home. Somewhere beyond the pines, a bird called out like spring had finally been allowed in. And the story, for once, didn't end with goodbye. It ended with stay.